What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. So if you have a Grand Cherokee, specifically a WK2, and you are looking to lift it, this is the perfect video for you. I'm going to go over all the specs of the lift on the Trail Trooper and everything that I recommend, since I have changed things up quite a bit. So let's go check it out, and I will go over everything on the Jeep. So if you've been following the build, you know that I am running a 33.5-inch tire, specifically a 295/70/17. I am running a Maxxis Razor, which measures a little bigger than most of the same tires in the same size. So technically it measures 33.5 by 12.3, so a pretty big tire. You've probably noticed that I did have to cut the bumper, and I did not originally have to do that with the 285/70/17s. But these were just a little bit bigger, and they did require me to cut the front bumper to not hit it when I'm going off-road. I think on the road it might have been okay, but it would have been really tight. One of the first things I did when I lifted this was go with a JBA control arm, and the reason for that was these spacers threw off the alignment. So you can see in there I am running the JBA control arms. I actually just recently did the ball joints on this because I had about 45,000 miles on the original ones, and they were starting to get loose, and my alignment guy told me I really needed to replace them. So one of the positive things about the JBA control arms is the ball joints are extremely easy to replace. It's just the 4 bolts in there. I bought one of their rebuild kits. It was $60 for both sides. Super cheap, really quick to change out, and one of the biggest reasons I recommend going with an aftermarket control arm, especially if you plan on keeping your Jeep for a while and you know you're going to have to replace the ball joints in the future. So JBA control arms are not that bad to replace. There's the hardest part about replacing these control arms is the bolt in the back, specifically back here. It's kind of hard to get to. The passenger side is the easier of the two sides. The driver's side is a major pain in the butt to replace that back bolt. One thing to note, I don't know what it was, but the original grease boot I had on these on the first set was always leaking, but for some reason this one fits a lot better. I never have grease on the outside. The other ones I constantly had grease coming out, so I don't know what the deal with that was. I don't know if they changed it or what, but these fit a lot better than the original ball joints that were on these JBA control arms. So as you can see, these Bilsteins look really good under there. I got the B Woody extended links in there, which I would suggest looking into if you want to lift your WK2 more than 2.5 inches. So once you start getting around the 3-inch mark, you really need to see if your sway bar links are binding up or holding up your lift, basically, once you start getting up there a little bit more. This design has been talked about by some other users. I haven't had any issues. You just have to make sure they are positioned correctly. The instructions with them are crap, so I had to look online to kind of figure out what angle these were supposed to go at. But they are good so far. No binding issues, nothing major to talk about. But if you want to go over what settings I have these Bilstein 5100s at, I actually started with these things at the top notch which would be their highest setting, which is about 2 inches of lift or so. So to me, the ride seemed a little rough at the highest setting. So, and also, I wasn't at the exact height I wanted. I was a lot lower than I was before in the front, probably about, almost an inch or so. So I did some thinking and decided, okay, I'm gonna have to run a spacer again, because originally I was gonna just run the springs and the Bilsteins and not run a spacer, but when I wanted to get it to the correct height, I decided I had to go back to a spacer if I was gonna stick with the Hemi springs. Now, if I had gone to something like an OME front spring, I wouldn't have to do that because they are a lift spring. So, for you 3.6 guys, I am running a Hemi coil up front. Now, the original reason I did that was to basically compensate for the extra weight I added in the front with the winch and the skid plates and all that. It was weighing down the original 2.5 inch lift that I was running. The 3.6 springs just couldn't handle the extra weight. So I switched over to a Hemi spring to get the lift back up to where it was supposed to. And in the process, I gained about 1/2 inch. That was the reason I went with the Hemi coil spring. So if you're running a 3.6 and you have a winch and you notice the front end has gone down a little bit from the extra weight, look into switching over to an OEM Hemi coil spring. So the specs up front are the Bilstein 5100 set at the second notch, which is about 3/4 of an inch, a 2-inch leveling spacer. I'm specifically using a Rocky Road off-road spacer. You can use something from Rough Country as well. It's the 2-inch leveling spacer, so not the bigger one that comes with the 2.5-inch kit. It's just the front leveling spacer. And then the Hemi coil springs. So altogether, I'm in between 2 3/4 and 3 inches of lift up front, which is perfect for this setup. If I could go higher, I would, but you start to run into issues with CV angles and whatnot. So I feel like this is the perfect height for the front end. All right, so moving on to the back. Now, I had just got this rear done, got rid of the factory toe shocks and switched over to a regular shock and spring setup. Now, the main thing that you have to note when you're going to do that is you have to change out springs if you're going to get rid of the leveling shocks, because the factory leveling shock springs are softer than the regular setup. And the reason for that is the factory leveling shocks basically add oil in to compensate for extra weight in the back to lift the back up to the height it's supposed to be at. So they kind of do some lifting in addition to the spring. So if you switch it out to a regular shock and keep the toe leveling springs, you're going to lose about 1 inch in height or so. So looking under there, see the Bilsteins under there, B Woody links again. So I'm running a OME medium duty lift coil in addition to a 3/4 inch spacer. Now, when I originally installed these OME springs, I didn't run the spacer, and it sat okay, but I think once they settled a little bit, it got to where basically the Jeep was sitting almost dead level. So that was okay, but once you start adding weight on the back, if you want to tow a trailer, and honestly just accelerating, the back end was going down, so it almost looked like it was squatting when I was driving, and that wasn't what I wanted. So I added a 3/4 inch spacer, which I ended up making this one. I had a buddy that got rid of his Rough Country lift in the back, so we had the small spacer that goes underneath, and I added some metal rings on the back to get it exactly at 3/4 of an inch, and basically that is under the coil, and that got it to exactly where it was sitting before I switched the springs out. So it is sitting exactly where it was with the leveling shocks and the 1 3/4 inch spacer. So for reference, I am about 38.5 inches from ground to the bottom of the fender, which is exactly where it was sitting before, which is perfect for my setup. Now, when you go to look for the OME springs, you're going to see two options. You're going to see a heavy duty and you're going to see a medium duty. And I had to go through the same debate, which one should I go with, because I have a little bit extra weight in the back with the tire carrier and the compressor and all that, but not too much extra weight. So I decided to go with the medium duty. Now, if you're doing an overland setup, if you had a rear tire carrier like a Wilco or my old setup where the weight is pushed farther back, causing the rear to sag a little bit more, I would look into the heavy duty. But with my current setup, I think the medium duty was the way to go. I didn't want to really sacrifice ride quality and get it too stiff and go with the heavy duty. So I decided to take a chance, go with the medium duty, and the ride is perfect in my opinion. Now, I use that spacer that I was talking about to get it to the perfect height. So if you have not lifted a WK2 before, give yourself a couple days if you're planning on doing it yourself. The front end was the hardest of the sides to do. The back is like nothing. The front, the biggest problem is how they put the axle in the center of the, you can see it goes in between the center of the strut. You basically, to remove that strut, you have to remove the axle. I have done it before to where I didn't completely remove it, but it was a pain. So it's just easier to remove the whole CV out to do it. Once you've done it a few times, it's not as bad. But that first time you do it, you're probably going to be hitting a lot of things and cussing because it is a pain in the butt. I don't know why Jeep didn't decide to put the, basically offset the strut a little bit so the CV wasn't going through the middle of it, but this is how they designed it, so you kind of have to work around it. So if you're asking yourself, why is this video titled a lift for the 2011 to 2015 Grand Cherokee? Well, the reason is I'm using a Bilstein setup. Now, Bilstein does not offer a lift for the 16 and newer WK2. Now, the reason for that is in 2016, Jeep changed how the sway bar link mounts. So instead of on the lower control arm, you now have it mounting on the strut. So currently, Bilstein does not offer a setup for that. The reason, I don't know. I don't know why Jeep changed how they mounted the sway bar link, and I don't know why Bilstein didn't make a lift for the 2016 and newer. It seems like they're missing out on a whole market, but beats me. I don't run that company, so hopefully Bilstein will come out with a lift in the future for the 2016 and newer, because I know if I were to get another Jeep, I would love to run the Bilsteins again. But currently, that's not an option. I have seen people talk about possibly switching out the control arm to be able to run that setup, but I don't know if that would be even worth it. Currently, for you 2016 and newer guys, you're going to have to run something like a OME or a Dobitson, but you know, that's not a bad thing. It's just a little bit more money. The Bilsteins for me were kind of a good price overall. So for you guys that have a Hemi or a diesel that are watching this, for everything else will work except the front spring setup, since I'm running a Hemi springs. Well, those are your OEM springs. So look into something like an OME spring on the front. You won't have to run a spacer, and you can basically just run the Bilsteins and the OME springs, which in my opinion would make this setup exactly perfect. So that is the one small thing about this setup that I don't like, but it was all about money. I already had the spacer and I already had the springs when I decided to switch to this setup. So all in all, specs again, Bilstein set at the second notch, 2-inch leveling spacer, and the Hemi coil springs up front. And then out back, we have the OME medium duty springs and the 3/4 inch spacer. So I will throw up the specs of my lift compared to a factory 4x4 limited. I ended up going to a dealership and measuring one. I didn't have the specs from when it was stock. So That'll give you guys an idea of how my setup compares to a factory setup. Also how my clearance is compared to a factory Jeep. Now on a factory Jeep, I'm not sure where they get the ground clearance of 8.6 inches from. But on my setup, I'll show you guys where I measured, since it's the lowest point on the Jeep underneath. So originally my muffler was hanging down lower, but since I switched to these new mufflers, they're tucked up nice and tight. The lowest point that I found underneath is going to be this bottom of this front spot right of the sump guard. So right here is going to be your lowest spot. And I measured that right at about 13.5 inches of clearance. And that's one of the biggest benefits of independent suspension. If in your head the only benefit to independent suspension is clearance. So you don't have a diff hanging low to get hung up on rocks. You can run, you know, straight down the middle. So hopefully that answers any of y'all's questions about what lift I'm running and what I think is the best setup for the WK2. So if you have not already subscribed to my channel, make sure to hit that button and hit the bell to get notified for any future videos I upload. So if you like the video, give me a thumbs up and we will catch you guys in the next video.